Hello everyone, how's it going? After 3 videos spent looking for all of the bonuses, Kong letters, and warp barrels, it's time to stop monkeying around because we're about to go absolutely bananas. Today we lay the smackdown with the leader of the bunch. We're going solo Donkey Kong against all 40 stages on DK Isle. We will not be using any help from any animal pals, bonus rooms, checkpoint barrels, not even our trusty and nimble friend Diddy Kong. Right off the bat, there's a handful of things to say about all of this. Stages have 2 to 5 DK barrels, and going from being allowed several mistakes to being allowed none all of a sudden makes this a pretty intense experience. While taking on these levels, not only was it significantly harder, but several moments made it very clear that this is not the intended way to play the game. You might think of DK barrels and checkpoints as totally optional, and they usually are, but there are plenty of moments where the only place for you to go is through one of those barrels. Blast barrels are sometimes pointing right at them, and in every boss fight you're put right into one as well. At least you're able to set them down if you accidentally pick one up, but some of them just break on contact. When starting out with this idea, I knew some situations wouldn't be perfect, but with the spirit of challenge being first and foremost, I just made sure that nothing was ever advantageous. If I ever had an awkward situation with a DK barrel, I would tag Diddy Kong in, sacrifice, take a few steps back, and continue on. It's not really a hard problem to nullify, but it is fun to avoid as many of them as possible, although there are a couple more annoying examples that we'll look at later. But the significantly more inconvenient issue with this challenge is when you're forced through a checkpoint, like shot right into it with nowhere else to go. Or seemingly nowhere else to land after a jump. What that means is any failure after this, for this challenge, you'll have to lose your checkpoint for another valid attempt. And the only real way to do that, unfortunately, is using the reset. I thought you could lose it by grabbing another one on a different stage, but Donkey Kong Country can keep multiple checkpoints saved. This did end up being a really solid challenge. It basically feels like you're playing Donkey Kong Country on expert mode. All in all, after all of the deaths, we have 40 levels with Donkey Kong's face on there, and a hilariously low clear percent for beating every stage in the game with no bonuses. What will the hardest moments be for Donkey Kong to get through his entire game unassisted? Without further delay, here are the top 10 hardest levels beating Donkey Kong Country with Donkey Kong. Number 10. Torchlight Trouble. In the caves of Gorilla Glacier comes our most stark contrast compared to a normal playthrough. Since we can't have squawks light the way for us, we're playing this entire level in the dark. It wasn't for a while into the playthrough before the stage even crossed my mind, and the thought of playing through this one in the dark definitely had me thinking it'd be number 1. But fortunately, you can see enough to make it through without the torchlight. The checkpoint is hard to avoid, although you can, it isn't easy. And speaking of trying to avoid every DK barrel, you cannot avoid the one in this little crawl through passage. Which just means, let's go back and sacrifice Diddy to the barrel fire. The edges of platforms, enemies, spike wheels, and edges are all visible. Plus the fires are easy to see, which makes complete sense. I really thought this one would make the tip top of the list, but if you've recently played through the level, seeing the edges of everything doesn't make it all that much worse. It's not crystal clear, but it mostly comes down to the challenge of just making it through with solo DK. It's kind of fun playing it like this. It's surprisingly doable, to the point where I wonder if they ever considered a cave this dark without any light. Adding one was definitely a better and more exciting move to make, but just how visible things are without the light made me curious. If you're unfamiliar with the stage, this could seem downright impossible, but a couple practice runs through, it's not so bad to turn off the lights. It certainly is a unique and eye-catching challenge. While this darkness helped Torchlight Trouble make the list, a few other dark levels that were on the bubble should be mentioned. The dimly lit Bouncy Bonanza from Second World Monkey Mines. Also the intermittent outages in Blackout Basement from Fifth World Creme Croc Industries. And last but not least, Loopy Lights from the final 6th world, Chimp Caverns. Interestingly, even after not releasing squawks, If you lose a life after hitting the checkpoint, on your retry you will spawn with Squawks and his light. No other animal pal works this way, but I suppose it has to be designed like this, otherwise all of your retries would be in the dark, since Squawks isn't nearby, so it just starts you with him after a death. While the darkness is intimidating, it's not a terribly long level, and not too bad with a bit of visibility, especially if you're familiar with its layout, making it number 10 on the list. Number 9. Minecart Carnage. You know this list isn't playing around with the classic challenge of Minecart Carnage enhanced greatly by just using solo DK. An extra tricky part about the challenge here is you cannot make contact with a single DK barrel, otherwise Diddy is popping out to join you right in the cart. And at that point you're stuck with him since you can't take him back or go backwards. It can be difficult to avoid those barrels out here on the track, and you're more than likely to hit the checkpoint unless you remember exactly where it is. Overall, things start out pretty mild in Minecart Carnage, but the intermittent crocs can catch a player off guard. It's a bit later on where things get faster paced with more jumps, and some that are a little stretched with a slower pace after inclines. But overall, it's one of the most memorable levels and has a reputation as the first big jump and challenge, and it's made that much more difficult when you can't hit a DK barrel or checkpoint or any obstacle. There is a second cart level in the game 3 worlds later, Minecart Madness, but surprisingly, Minecart Carnage on the second world is still harder. A classic challenge turned up a few more points, Minecart Carnage was worthy of number 9 on the list. Number 8. Slip Slide Ride. This gorgeous crystallized stage with its one-of-a-kind setting and soundtrack is not only home to beauty, but also some challenge, especially when trying to take DK from start to finish. There's an unforgiving mix of enemies, like jumping crocs, claptraps, armadillos, and zingers around sliding poles. The blue pulls you up and purple pulls you down. This design is also exclusive to this stage. With all of these novel obstacles and awkward heights that some of these challenges come on, you'll find it takes a decent amount of focus to not slip up once you're on Slip Slide Ride. There's one part in particular where you can't seem to avoid the DK barrel, since the path of the rope leads right through this tiny gap and it's right in the middle of it. The only way that I'm aware of to bypass this would be using the stage's warp, the light blue camouflage barrel toward the beginning of the stage, which cuts about 80% of the level out, but since we're playing these levels in full without any shortcuts, we'll just tag Diddy in, get rid of him, and get back to DK. It's a little tense out here on these hills and with these ropes. Some of these enemies can get the best of you. There's 3 DK barrels out here. Instead of being allowed 4 mistakes, you get none. Any little mishap and you're back to the beginning. It's a beautiful stage to look at and listen to, but it really can sting to get by with solo DK, making it number 7 on the list. Number 7. Tanked Up Trouble. It only makes sense that one of the more notoriously tricky stages is in the top 10. Tanked Up Trouble is a few minutes long, and it's not the simplest thing to make it through without a single mistake. You roll jump underneath a DK barrel before the track. There's a few of those out here, and one of them is particularly interesting to avoid. What makes it even more interesting is you can't tag a partner in on these moving platforms, so if we accidentally got Diddy, we'd be stuck with him far too long, an unacceptable amount of time. It really would taint the footage, so we have to avoid that. Grabbing the fuel barrels, avoiding the enemies, the challenge is all the same, but this time, you can't make any mistakes, and you have the bigger sprite of Donkey Kong. Grabbing the fuel barrels and making all the necessary jumps is its own issue, but a handful of moments is what stands out. Having to push the tire past the naughties without a mistake can be a little tense. You have to properly roll it onto the moving platform. And a somewhat tricky thing to do, unique to this challenge, is keeping that tire just to use it to hit this fuel barrel without using the blast, since it would hit the DK barrel. The various jumps for fuel containers and around enemies, especially the zingers, can be tough and wear on your nerves after a few minutes for the full ride from start to finish. Tanked Up Trouble is known as one of the harder levels in the game, and for this challenge, it earned number 7 on the list. Number 6. Millstone Mayhem. Only from the second world, Monkey Mines, Millstone Mayhem has some considerably tough parts with just Donkey Kong. This is the level where you're likely to get Winky the Frog, who makes jumping over issues much easier, and at the very least will tank a hit for you on the hardest of parts. It's also common to be able to continue just because you can afford to lose one of your Kongs. but not with solo DK. It's all pretty standard enough, with the challenge of running away from the beaver wheels with some enemies in front of you, until two specific parts come to mind. Later in the stage, there's a wheel going back and forth over a couple gaps with a snake in each of them. The hit detection can be a little wonky jumping on these guys, and the wheel zipping back and forth overhead doesn't make it easy. So there's another layer of challenge approaching it like this, whereas you could normally just jump over with the frog. The other part that's quite tense is the standalone nut throwing necky. The tempo and coverage of the nuts being thrown makes it an uneasy task toward the end of the level. Even with decent timing, you might get hit at the same time you make your move. These moments were enough to get Millstone Mayhem number 6 on the list. Number 5. Elevator Antics. This level has some tight spots. It starts out with a lot of snakes for a while, and Necky Juniors. Some of the timing can be a bit stiff with the tunnel crawling and the snakes. The zingers and ropes are probably the worst parts, although the final stretch of elevators aren't forgiving either. The control required feels a bit advanced to get by completely unscathed, especially the part with these darker bees. Their horizontal movement makes this very awkward. Many players would just tank the hit knowing they'll get another DK barrel, but now things aren't so forgiving. All of this before testing your nerves with multiple timed elevators and zingers. Amongst all of this, they have a couple of the trickiest Necky Juniors that behave unique to this level, with a quick pace of 2 low shots and 1 high. This bit of variety can easily catch a player that isn't quite ready. Something that adds to the awesome eeriness of this challenge is the length of the song. It's not often a player is around long enough on the stage from start to finish without a single bonus room in order to hear its final parts. The song providing these tense and odd notes during the tightest jump of all to cap off the level. Now this can play with your eyes right here. It's one of those things that might feel easiest as you first approach it, but once you're settled on the tire trying to time it, the window feels pretty small. The last thing you want to do is play the whole stage again, because there's a lot you have to do. It's a pretty long level. Bees on the ropes, the series of enemies and elevators, those Necky Juniors, including that final one, was enough to place Elevator Antics number 5 on the list. Number 4. Trick Track Trek. Another level from Kremkrock Industries. This memorable challenge only gets that much worse with DK. It's also really annoying to complete this track without hitting a DK barrel, and when you're on the lift, the game won't allow you to trade places, like we've mentioned, and you can't go backwards to fix it. I'd say the pace and placement of some of these vultures is what helps move this level above its spiritual successor on the next world, Tanked Up Trouble. They try to catch you off guard. Jumping is usually the easiest way to deal with these guys, but a bit more satisfying is to lay the smackdown. Especially the ones that you're slowly lowered into. Now that's awesome. It's basically like a big endurance test to get through it all at once. A couple minutes of neckies, a bit more tight moments when you have some enemies released from overhead. It's amazing what it seems like you have to do to avoid this DK barrel. Despite the fact that the gap is much smaller than DK's sprite, he can simply duck underneath. It appears the stinger drags right through DK's face and down his entire back. The hitbox must be literally pixels away from contact. By the way, fair warning, don't try to get too stylish against this buff croc on the platform, otherwise things can get a little crazy. Because of the quick vultures and all of the grief this stage gave me while figuring things out, is why I had to put Trick Track Trek up at number 4 on the list. Number 3. Ice Age Alley. The third level of Gorilla Glacier is when you're on your way out of the storm. But it takes some skill and you have to face a handful of difficult moments that are amplified when just using Donkey Kong. Usually you'd grab your partner and Espresso on the left, who can be very useful with his long jumps and flapping wings. Not being able to use him to jump and flap over enemies and large gaps with ease definitely changes the entire experience. Plus the ostrich's long legs help stand over claptraps in tight spots. You'll be faced with rope swings, slippery platforming, and every enemy on your own. The Necky Juniors are quick in a couple spots too. The worst of all though, I'd say, later into the level are the orangutans on top of a few hills. This angle, with not much room for error, is a real sad way to go back to the beginning of the stage. There's also a pretty tricky DK barrel to avoid, placed right above a claptrap that you'll have to be careful with. The checkpoint barrel also takes some deliberate movement to get around. There's a decent mix of enemies and death pits that can catch you, plus dying toward the end on one of those barrel throws really makes it quite the punishing test. This right here, on this gap, is one of the tighter moves you have to make. All of this has helped place Ice Age Alley all the way up at number 3 on the list. Number 2, Poison Pond. You want to talk about toxic? Look no further than solo Donkey Kong in Poison Pond. This murky water is full of spike wheels, some diagonally swimming squids that take some tough angles, and piranhas. There's plenty of DK barrels. There's 4 in fact, along with Engard the swordfish, who would help quite a bit, because they know it's hard to avoid getting touched. It's made even tougher just using the big gorilla. There are some surprising moments where fish will swim right in your face. Same goes with the movement of the spiky wheels. But what really puts the stage over the top is its final section. There's a stretch where these piranhas are released at you at varying heights with varying speed, making it an incredibly hard stage to finish. Worse yet, making it a few minutes up to this point just to get touched here and have to do it all over again makes it quite the nightmare-inducing challenge. I had early attempts get me all the way to this point, and having to face the reality of being hit and starting over is jarring and can make you collapse like a house of cards. This level right here, in fact, can be so frustrating and difficult to finish, it really had me thinking if it's worthy of number 1. Poison Pond will poison your soul if you're faced with this challenge, caught in a limbo of swimming all the way to the end just to get clipped to repeat the entire tedious level all over again. Having to do it all with DK without touching anything pushes it to an entirely new level. The other 3 water levels have their moments, especially Clam City and Croctopus Chase. They all give you a fair amount of DK barrels, not to mention the swordfish if you can find them. So if you're looking to spice these swimming levels up, try unassisted, no DK barrels or checkpoints. Not being allowed a single swimming mistake from start to finish with the larger spread of Donkey Kong adds quite a bit more pressure, to say the least, and the absolute most menacing of all of these aquatic tests has to be Poison Pond. When tackling this challenge, it definitely tastes like poison, making Poison Pond worthy of number 2 on the list. Before we get to number 1, just want to do a quick honorable mentions montage around a minute long, showing some of the other difficult and memorable moments from solo DK in Donkey Kong Country. Alright, here we are. What is the hardest level in Donkey Kong Country just with Donkey Kong? Number 1, Snow Barrel Blast. The first level of Gorilla Glacier is the first part of a notoriously bone-chilling stretch of challenges, all taking place before the world's save point. Once you're through it, it's a stage you never want to see again. Unfortunately for some players, you get stuck in a limbo of game overs, having to repeat this stretch over and over again. With the music and atmosphere, it's a place that slowly makes you realize how grim things have become in the icy mountaintops. The direness of the situation dawns on you through the level as the snowstorm picks up and is at its fullest force right as you're shot into the checkpoint. It's fitting that the most difficult stage in the game forces you into the checkpoint. They're trying to do you the smallest favor because things get pretty nerve-wracking as this level goes on. Even more uneasy, hearing the music track's more obscure notes over a couple minutes in that you'll only hear with extended play, like attempting this daunting level from start to finish. Every mistake we make is a painful reset, which is definitely inconvenient, but kind of just adds to the unusual aspect of this DK challenge. While tough platforming or swimming certainly ask a good amount of skill from the player, nothing plays as cutthroat as quickly spinning barrels over the devastatingly long death pit. Then throw some bees in to mess with the player's mind and timing, you've got yourself a real test of nerves. Having to reset this stage each missed shot was a bit of a soul crusher, but at the same time, the anticipation and nervousness this level can still provide was pretty exciting, and after a handful of missed blasts and resets, we were finally able to make it through from start to finish, with those odd and beautiful rare notes of the soundtrack playing during the notorious blasting sections. Having to play through the level like this, I would say boosted up to almost near Battletoads level of difficulty and unforgivable nature, making Snow Barrel Blast number 1 the hardest level to beat from start to finish without any assistance. But that's just what I found. What were your most memorable challenges from Donkey Kong Country? Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.